They shoved him before they even knew his name. In that brief, shame-soaked moment, dozens of strangers learned exactly how ugly power looked when it wore a uniform and a prejudice. Malcolm Cross had traveled through dozens of airports: London, Dubai, Tokyo, without incident. He had been frisked in war zones, wanned by NATO soldiers, even delayed by curious customs officers. But nothing compared to what was about to unfold at Terminal B of the Washington International Airport. This wasn't about security. This was about what color his skin told people before he could speak. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos: flight announcements echoing overhead, the scent of burnt coffee mixing with perfume, hurried footsteps tapping against the polished floor. Malcolm walked with the slow confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and exactly where he was going. In his tailored charcoal suit, black silk tie, and polished leather shoes, he was the picture of quiet authority. His silver wristwatch, a gift from a head of state, glinted under the cold light. Then came the voice. "Sir, step over here," barked a man in a TSA uniform. Stocky, red-faced, hair buzzed so short it seemed carved into his skull. His name tag read Harrison. The way he said "sir" was like an insult wrapped in formality. Malcolm stopped, raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "You've been randomly selected for a secondary screening," Harrison said, glancing not at Malcolm's passport or boarding pass, but directly at his face. Randomly, in this case, felt like the oldest lie in the book. From the corner of his eye, Malcolm noticed a young woman in linea brunette in a white sundress waltz through security without so much as a sideways glance from the officers. Her eyes darted toward him, lingered a second, then slid away in discomfort. "Of course," Malcolm said evenly. He stepped toward the designated area, pulling his carry-on behind him. His voice stayed calm, but his mind began cataloging every detail. The distance between cameras, the officer's body language, the murmurs among passengers. Years in defense taught him to observe before acting. Harrison's inspection was more of an interrogation. "Where are you traveling from? What's the purpose of your visit? Do you always travel with this much cash?" His hands rifled through Malcolm's briefcase, flipping through confidential files he had no clearance to see. "You have no authority to read those documents," Malcolm said, a low steel in his tone. Harrison smirked. "Looks suspicious. You people think you can." The sentence hung in the air like a spark over dry leaves. A taller officer, badge reading Klein, stepped closer, hand resting on his holstered taser. "Is there a problem here?" "Yeah," Harrison replied, still looking at Malcolm. "Got ourselves a non-compliant passenger. Might need to detain." The word detain made the nearby passengers shuffle awkwardly, whispering in low tones. A man in a baseball cap muttered something about troublemakers, while a mother pulled her son closer, as if Malcolm were dangerous simply by existing. Inside, Malcolm felt the slow burn of humiliation one he'd seen countless young black men endure in silence. But this time, it was happening to him. And he wasn't just any traveler. He was the man whose signature authorized billion-dollar defense contracts, who had private meetings with generals and presidents, who could pick up a phone and cause careers to crumble. But none of that mattered to Harrison. Not yet. When Harrison ordered him to remove his jacket and tie, Malcolm complied. When told to unlace his shoes, he complied. But when Harrison demanded his phone and began scrolling without consent, Malcolm's voice dropped to a tone that could freeze a room. "You've overstepped." The pause was brief but heavy. Klein shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the security cameras. "What did you just say to me?" Harrison sneered. Malcolm straightened to his full height. "I said, you've overstepped, and you'll regret it before the day ends." Harrison's laugh was sharp and ugly. "You threatening me?" "No," Malcolm said, a small, humorless smile touching his lips. "Just stating a fact." The crowd was growing now, passengers craning their necks, phones half raised to record. The drama was irresistible. Then, without warning, Harrison shoved Malcolm's shoulder. Hard. The carry-on tipped over, spilling documents onto the floor. Classified seals stamped in red were suddenly visible to anyone looking. Klein swore under his breath, realizing the gravity. "Pick that up," Harrison ordered, tone dripping with mock authority. Malcolm didn't move. His eyes locked onto Harrison's with the precision of a sniper sighting a target. The terminal noise faded. All Malcolm heard was his own heartbeat, steady as a drum. "Do you know who I am?" he asked quietly. Harrison smirked again. Doesn't matter. Oh, it will, Malcolm replied. And that's when the first passenger, an older man in a navy blazer, stepped forward. I know who he is, the man said loudly enough for nearby phones to pick it up. And if you knew, you'd be apologizing right now. Harrison blinked, the first flicker of uncertainty cracking through his smug exterior. Malcolm's phone, still in Harrison's hand, began to ring. The caller ID read, Secretary of Defense. The ringing cut through the heavy silence like a blade. Harrison glanced at the glowing screen, the name burning into his retinas, Secretary of Defense. He hesitated, confusion flickering across his face before being quickly buried under bravado. You expect me to believe this, he scoffed, holding the phone up as if it were some kind of joke. Malcolm didn't answer it, even blink. His calm was unnerving, the kind you only saw in people who understood exactly how much power they wielded. Answer it, Malcolm said quietly. For a split second, Harrison considered tossing the phone into Malcolm's bag and walking away. But pride had teeth. He tapped the screen and barked. Yeah, this is... Who is this? The voice on the other end was clipped, urgent. It was the kind of tone that made junior officers stand straighter and seasoned commanders choose their words carefully. This is TSA Officer Harrison, Washington International. I have a passenger here who... You mean Chairman Malcolm Cross? The temperature in the air seemed to drop with each syllable. Put him on. Now. Harrison froze. His eyes darted from the phone to Malcolm's unreadable face. For the first time since the encounter began, the security officer's confidence faltered. Wordlessly, he extended the phone. Malcolm took it without looking at Harrison. Yes, Madam Secretary. His voice was even, but there was an undercurrent of steel. No, I'm not injured. Yes, I was detained without cause. I'm still at the checkpoint. He listened, his gaze fixed on Harrison like a hawk watching a trembling rabbit. That won't be necessary, he said finally. I'll handle it here. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and began collecting his documents from the floor. He did it with deliberate care, as if every second made Harrison sweat a little more. The crowd's whispers swelled into a low roar. What was that? Klein asked, his voice low. That, Malcolm said, sliding a classified folder into his briefcase, was the United States Secretary of Defense. And in about 20 minutes, she's going to be calling your director. I suggest you start thinking about what you're going to say. Harrison's face flushed crimson, the color climbing up his neck. Look, I was just following protocol. No, Malcolm cut in sharply. You were following prejudice. There's a difference. His voice carried, slicing through the ambient noise. People nearby shifted uncomfortably, realizing the gravity of what they'd just witnessed. A young man in a hoodie, phone in hand, muttered, "This is going viral." Another passenger, a middle-aged black woman, stood taller, nodding in quiet solidarity. Malcolm took a step closer to Harrison, lowering his voice so only he and Klein could hear. I could end your career before you even finish your shift. But that's not what matters. What matters is that you'll walk away from this thinking you were just doing your job. That's the part that makes you dangerous. Klein swallowed hard. Sir, if we... You, Malcolm said, eyes still locked on Harrison, are dismissed. It wasn't a request. It was an order, one Klein obeyed without hesitation, stepping back like a soldier retreating from a superior officer. But Harrison stood rooted, jaw tight, chest heaving. You think you're better than me because of your money? Your title? No, Malcolm said. I think I'm better than you because I know how to treat a human being with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. A ripple went through the crowd. Someone clapped soft at first, then louder, joined by others. It wasn't a roaring ovation, but it was enough to make Harrison's face harden with humiliation. Malcolm didn't bask in it. He simply closed his briefcase, picked up his carry-on, and started toward the boarding gates. But Harrison's voice followed. You think the world's going to change because of some speech? Because of you. Malcolm stopped mid-step, turning just enough to look over his shoulder. No, he said. The world changes because enough people decide not to stay silent. Today, that's me. Tomorrow, it might be the kid who just watched you shove me for no reason. He kept walking. By the time Malcolm reached the VIP lounge, news had already traveled ahead of him. The front desk attendant, young, nervous, and trying not to stare, offered a deferential smile. Right this way, Mr. Cross. We've been informed of the situation. Inside, The lounge was an oasis of soft lighting and hushed conversation. He settled into a leather chair, exhaling slowly. Years of boardrooms, negotiations, and classified briefings had taught him to stay calm under pressure. But encounters like this raw, personal left a different kind of bruise. A man approached from across the room. Early 50s, military posture, eyes sharp but warm. Malcolm recognized him instantly. General James Kincaid, a senior Pentagon advisor. "Heard you had a rough time downstairs," Kincaid said, lowering himself into the seat across from Malcolm. Words already circling in DC phones are lighting up. "Let it circle," Malcolm replied. "Some lessons need to travel fast." Kincaid studied him for a moment. "You gonna press charges?" Malcolm sipped his coffee. "No, I'm going to make an example." The general smirked knowingly. "You're thinking bigger." "Always." While Malcolm sat in the lounge, Harrison was being summoned to his supervisor's office. Klein had already given his account, shaky but honest. The supervisor's face was pale as she listened, tapping a pen against the desk. "Do you realize who you just assaulted?" she asked finally. Harrison crossed his arms. "Some big-shot executive. The chairman of one of the largest defense contractors in the world. A man whose influence reaches from the Pentagon to NATO headquarters. And you shoved him. On camera. In front of witnesses." Harrison opened his mouth, then closed it again. His stomach churned. "You've just handed the agency a PR nightmare," she continued. "And if that wasn't bad enough, he's a personal friend of the Secretary of Defense." The reality hit like a punch to the ribs. Harrison sat down heavily, the weight of his arrogance sinking in. Back in the lounge, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was a message from an aide. Clips from the incident already have 1.2 M views. Hashtag flying while black, trending. He watched one of the videos. Harrison's shove replayed in grainy clarity, the sound of passengers gasping in unison. Then came Malcolm's calm, cutting words about prejudice. The comments section was a firestorm outrage, support, calls for accountability. The aide sent another message. "Morning show's already calling. Want to comment?" Malcolm typed back, "Not yet. Let the story breathe." He knew the value of timing. The longer the clips circulated without his direct input, the more the narrative would form around what people saw, not what they were told. When the time came, he'd speak. And when he did, the message would be impossible to ignore. That night, after arriving at his destination, Malcolm attended a private dinner with senior defense officials and foreign dignitaries. The incident came up almost immediately. "Malcolm," one ambassador said, shaking his head, "I don't know how you keep your composure in situations like that." "Because I've been dealing with them my whole life," Malcolm replied. "This wasn't the first time. Won't be the last. But each time, I make sure the person responsible remembers it for the rest of theirs." Across the table, a junior officer asked, "So what happens to that guy now?" Malcolm's gaze hardened. "That depends on whether he learns something from it. If not, he'll just be another man who thinks the badge on his chest makes him untouchable." A silence fell over the table. No one doubted he meant every word. 2 days later, Harrison was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The official statement from the TSA was bland, full of phrases like reviewing procedures and committed to diversity and inclusion. But behind the scenes, there was chaos. Congressional staffers were asking questions. Advocacy groups were demanding reforms. And Malcolm had been invited to testify before a Senate committee on racial profiling and transportation security. When he took the stand weeks later, the room was packed reporters, officials, activists. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone. "On that day," he began, "I was not chairman of a defense corporation. I was not a man with influence or connections. I was, in the eyes of one officer, nothing more than a threat because of my skin color. And that is exactly why this conversation matters." He laid out the details with precision: what was said, what was done, what it revealed about the system. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough. When he finished, the room erupted into quiet applause, not because of who he was, but because of what he stood for. Later, as he left the Capitol building, a young black man in a suit approached him. "Mr. Cross," he said, voice trembling slightly, "I saw the video. I work in aviation security. I just wanted to say thank you for not staying silent." Malcolm smiled faintly, shook his hand. "Don't thank me. Just make sure that when it's your turn to stand up, you do." And with that, he walked away, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the distant murmur of the city, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be quiet. The air outside the Capitol felt heavier than when he'd gone in. A wall of cameras and microphones waited, bristling like a thicket of steel and glass. Journalists jostled for position, shouting questions. Mr. Cross, do you believe this is an isolated incident or part of a systemic problem? Will you call for the officer's termination? Malcolm raised a hand, not to silence them, but to slow the chaos. I'm not here for a personal vendetta, he said, his voice cutting through the din. I'm here to make sure no one else, executive or not, gets treated as suspicious simply for existing in their own skin. This isn't about one officer. This is about the culture that trains and protects men like him. The statement was measured, almost surgical, enough to draw headlines, but not enough to be dismissed as emotional retaliation. The crowd erupted into a frenzy of follow-ups, but Malcolm was already moving toward the waiting black sedan. Inside the car, his aide, Mariah, handed him a tablet. You've got to see this, she said. On the screen was a live stream of Harrison's neighbors had gone on record, calling him a good man who was just under stress. Another video showed a counter-narrative forming online, with a small but loud group claiming Malcolm had overreacted and played the race card. Malcolm watched in silence, scrolling through the comments. Then he handed the tablet back. People will believe what they're comfortable believing, he said. Our job isn't to convince everyone. It's to make sure the truth is impossible to ignore. 3 days later, Malcolm returned to Washington International Airport, not to fly, but to walk the same terminal where it all happened. Cameras followed at a distance. The TSA had agreed to give him a private meeting with its leadership, but Malcolm insisted on arriving through the public checkpoint first. The terminal felt different now. People recognized him instantly. Whispers trailed in his wake, some curious, others deferential. A middle-aged black man in a pilot's uniform passed by, giving a subtle nod of respect. At the security lane, a young female officer greeted him with a professional smile. Mr. Cross, we're honored to have you. We've been briefed on your visit. Her voice carried none of the hostility he'd faced before, just measured courtesy. It was progress, but Malcolm knew it wasn't proof of change. Inside the TSA conference room, Director Elaine Porter rose to shake his hand. Mr. Cross, thank you for coming. I want to start by apologizing personally and on behalf of the agency. Malcolm returned the handshake, but his eyes didn't soften. Apologies are important, Director. Accountability is better. The conversation that followed was tense, but civil. Malcolm outlined specific reforms, improved bias training, transparent incident reviews, a requirement for officers to state the objective reason for secondary screenings. Porter took notes, nodding, but Malcolm could see the calculation behind her eyes, the careful balancing of public image and institutional resistance. When the meeting ended, Porter assured him changes were coming. Malcolm left without committing to optimism. He'd learned long ago that promises from power often wilted under the heat of convenience. Meanwhile, Harrison sat in his small apartment, blinds drawn against the midday sun. His phone buzzed periodically, old friends texting support, strangers sending threats. The union had provided him with a lawyer, but the investigation loomed like a storm cloud that refused to move. On his kitchen table lay a printed headline. TSA officer suspended after racist confrontation with CEO. Under it, a grainy still from the viral video captured the exact moment he'd shoved Malcolm. Harrison stared at it, jaw clenched. He told himself it was blown out of proportion, that he'd been doing his job. That random selection really was random. But late at night, when the noise died down, a quieter voice in his head whispered the truth. He'd seen a black man in an expensive suit and made a decision in the space of a heartbeat. And now, the world knew. Malcolm's return to his office in Arlington was met with a standing ovation from his staff. He smiled politely, but quickly waved them back to work. We have contracts to finalize, he said, settling behind his desk. Later that afternoon, Mariah stepped in with a folder. This just came in. Harrison's preliminary hearing with the TSA Review Board is next week. Press wants to know if you'll attend. Malcolm tapped a pen against the desk. No, this isn't about watching him burn. It's about making sure the fire doesn't spread. Mariah hesitated. You know, some people think you're letting him off too easy. That's because they think justice is the same as vengeance, Malcolm said. It's not. Justice changes the future. Vengeance just feels good in the moment. The day of the hearing, the media swarmed outside TSA headquarters. Harrison arrived flanked by his lawyer, looking smaller than the man who had stood puffed up at the airport. Inside, the panel reviewed footage, statements, and procedural guidelines. When the video played Malcolm's calm voice against Harrison's aggression, the room went still. Even the lawyer's arguments about security protocol felt hollow under the weight of what was on the screen. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came: termination. Harrison sat motionless as the words landed, his career reduced to a line on paper. Outside, reporters swarmed him for comment. "No statement," he muttered, pushing through the crowd. The cameras caught the flash of something raw in his expression, not just anger, but the first traces of shame. That evening, Malcolm received a message from an unknown number. "You got what you wanted. Hope you're happy." No signature, but the tone was unmistakable. He didn't reply. Instead, he stood at his penthouse window, watching the city lights flicker against the night. Somewhere out there, Harrison was probably telling himself a story that painted him as the victim. But Malcolm knew change was never neat. Sometimes, it started with a man losing his job. Sometimes, with a conversation in a hallway. Sometimes, with a video no one could unsee. The important thing was that the conversation had begun. Weeks passed. Malcolm's schedule filled with meetings, travel, speeches. Yet the incident clung to the public consciousness. Policy discussions about racial profiling in transportation gained momentum. A bipartisan bill for enhanced TSA bias training began to take shape. Advocacy groups invited Malcolm to join advisory boards. He declined most offers, choosing to focus on the bigger picture. One rainy afternoon, he received a letter handwritten, unmarked except for the post office stamp, from a small town in Virginia. Inside was a single page. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not even sure I deserve it. But I see now what I didn't see before. Harrison." Malcolm read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in his desk drawer. Forgiveness was its own kind of power, but it wasn't something he gave lightly. Still, the letter was proof of something he valued more than public outrage: the possibility, however small, that a man could change. The next month, Malcolm boarded a flight to Geneva for a high-level defense summit. At the security checkpoint, a young officer checked his documents, looked him in the eye, and said, "Welcome, Mr. Cross. Safe travels." No hesitation, no edge in the voice, just professional courtesy. As he walked toward the gate, Malcolm allowed himself a small smile. The world hadn't changed overnight. But here, in this small moment, it felt like a start. Geneva's winter lights spilled through the glass walls of the conference center, pale and clean, the kind that made everything look sharper than it was. Malcolm's presence at the summit was both business and symbol. His company's contracts made him indispensable, but his recent public stand had made him a figure of interest beyond the defense world. In the days between meetings, journalists tried to pivot every conversation toward the incident. Malcolm stayed measured, redirecting questions toward the summit's agenda. He knew the story's half-life. Eventually, the media would move on, and what remained would be the reforms, or the lack of them. But there was one request he didn't ignore. A small international nonprofit asked if he would speak at a youth forum on leadership and integrity. No cameras, no journalists, just a room of young professionals from across Europe and Africa. On the day of the talk, he stepped into a modest conference hall. About 50 people waited, seated in a loose circle. He didn't take the podium. He pulled a chair into the circle instead. "I was asked to talk about leadership," he began. "But I'm going to talk about humiliation." The room went still. He recounted the Washington International encounter, not with theatrical pauses or anger, but with the plain precision of a man laying out coordinates on a map. He told them how it felt to be reduced to suspect before human, and how the quietest part of himself, the part that had endured this before, almost wanted to let it slide. "That's the part you have to watch," he said. "Not the loud anger, the quiet resignation. Because that's how injustice survives, when we start expecting it." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "But you had the power to fight back. What about the people who don't?" Malcolm's gaze softened. "That's why I used mine. Because if I don't, then what's the point of having it?" Back in the U.S., Harrison's life had settled into an uncomfortable limbo. Job applications went unanswered. Old friends avoided his calls. The label the racist TSA officer from that viral video hung over him like smoke that clung no matter how often he tried to wash it off. One afternoon, while browsing the news on a library computer, he stumbled across a live stream. Malcolm was speaking at a university commencement ceremony, the headline reading, "From Boardroom to Battlefield, Lessons on Integrity." Harrison clicked, meaning to scoff, but he didn't. He watched. Malcolm spoke about discipline, about carrying yourself with dignity even when the room wants you small. He never mentioned Harrison's name, never retold the incident. But the subtext was clear. It wasn't about the man, it was about the mindset. When the speech ended, Harrison sat there longer than he meant to, staring at the darkened screen. A question lodged in his chest, one he couldn't shake. If he can stand there without hating me, why am I still clinging to hating him? Months later, on a humid afternoon in D.C., Malcolm received another letter. This one wasn't typed, wasn't defensive. The handwriting was uneven, as if the writer paused often. "Mr. Cross, I've started volunteering at a community center. I talk to kids about what not to do had I did. I don't excuse myself anymore. I don't expect you to answer. I just thought you should know. Harrison." Malcolm read it twice, then placed it next to the first letter in his drawer. He didn't reply, but something eased inside him. Summer turned to autumn, and the policy changes Malcolm had pushed for began rolling out mandatory anti-bias training, real-time oversight of random screenings, a public reporting channel for profiling complaints. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. He'd learned long ago that progress came in increments, not epiphanies. One evening, at a gala for a veterans charity, Malcolm stepped outside for air. The city's night hum was in full swing, distant sirens, laughter spilling from rooftop bars, the low growl of engines. A man in a dark jacket approached from the sidewalk, hesitating before speaking. "Mr. Cross." Malcolm turned. The face was thinner now, the eyes less hard, but he recognized Harrison instantly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Harrison said quickly. "I just saw you on the guest list. Thought I might run into you." Malcolm studied him for a long beat. "And what would you say if you did?" Harrison's throat worked. "That I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry you say to make something go away. The kind you say when you've had to live with yourself for a while and didn't like what you saw." The streetlight threw a pale circle between them. Malcolm's expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker of something acknowledgement, maybe. "You volunteering still?" he asked. "Yeah," Harrison said. "Every week." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Keep at it. That's the apology that matters." Harrison looked like he might say more, but instead he just nodded back and walked away, disappearing into the night crowd. Weeks later, Malcolm boarded another flight, no cameras, no fanfare. At security, the officer checked his ID, smiled politely, and waved him through without incident. It was unremarkable, almost boring. And that was the point. As he settled into his seat, he thought about the truth he'd come to accept. Change wasn't a headline, a viral clip, or even a firing. Change was a series of quiet moments in ordinary places, when someone chose not to repeat the mistake they'd once made or to stop someone else from making it. The plane taxied down the runway, engines building to that deep, resonant roar. Malcolm glanced out at the shrinking lights of the terminal, and in the reflection on the glass, he didn't see a man defined by the prejudice he'd faced. He saw a man who had used it to push the world, even slightly, in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.